I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. David Bobb.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, Michael, my friend John Todd, and welcome to you all. It's so good to be with you today. I'm delighted that we're able to, and thanks to your welcoming, that a Kansan is here, a friend of the Bill of Rights Institute, Bobb Kirkpatrick. Bobb, where are you? Great, so glad that you came today, couple-hour drive away. You can see from Bobb's tie where his heart is, and it's just such a pleasure to be with you all today. What I want to talk to you about really is the state and future of American civic education. As Rachel mentioned, my job is to work with a national community of more than 55,000 teachers. These teachers are in mainly the secondary grades, 7th through 12th grade. More than 1,000 of them are right here in the state of Kansas. These educators every day wake up trying to imagine what is it that they can do to try to bring the principles of the United States of America and the virtues that uphold our institutions to bear with young people. Now, before we get started today, and I'll have just a few slides, I don't normally use PowerPoint because power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Today I'm going to break that rule, but I won't have too many slides to share with you. But before I begin, how many of you actually had a class in your high school education that bore the title or had included in it civics? How many? Okay. So probably 2/3, maybe 80% of the crowd. How many of you had at least 2 years, 7th through 12th grade, of American history? Okay, so quite a few people as well. Today, I don't need to tell you the litany of challenges that we have in terms of the young people's knowledge of American history and civics. It runs roughly on the gold standard of exams that are given in this space, called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that in 8th grade and in 12th grade, fewer than 1 in 4 of American young people is even proficient in those two subject areas. Now, we know that schools were started with the idea that citizenship formation is the very reason that they exist. And today I come with some good news. Because while we could go on for the entire hour, or whatever time we have, and I want to make this a conversation, leaving lots of time for your comments, questions, and suggestions, we could proceed through the litany of really troubling statistics, a decline in civic education. But the good news is this: there's a lot of teachers every day that are working very hard with an American promise in mind. A promise that was extended in the Declaration of Independence, that found fulfillment in the Constitution and the principles that are articulated in our national charter, but that have to become more and more fully a part of every generation's understanding. And what I love about my work now, after having worked for 12 years at Hillsdale College and the last 7 with the Bill of Rights Institute, is that we are building what we hope can be an ever larger community of teachers, of young people, and of our fellow American citizens who share the common task of bringing those principles to bear on our daily life. Now, there are very real challenges to this, and we know what some of them are. I want to tell you a little bit about some of those that you might not have thought about, that might not be quite as evident. And we're going to talk about some of the debates that have roiled our country, in particular, the presentation of the 1619 Project, and also that of the 1776 Commission convened by President Trump. There is a lot of distance between those two frameworks for civic education. And what I would suggest to you today is that there is a path forward, that you ought not to despair, that even if you feel like there is little hope for seeing young people really turned on to the principles of the country, that in fact I think there is a lot of reason for that hope and even optimism. So the Bill of Rights Institute has this group of teachers. We built it up over a couple decades worth of work. We were started by a teacher who gave the name with a grant provided by the Charles Koch Foundation to the Bill of Rights Institute, not because we think our rights are found only in the Bill of Rights, because of course they're not, but because a lot of people imagine that that is so. And unfortunately, there is this common misperception that unless you have the rights articulated and guaranteed by the national government, that they don't accrue to you. And in fact, what we know from the Declaration of Independence is that human beings have rights because of the nature of their humanity. They are given to us from a creator. That's the language of the Declaration of Independence. And it is government's job, its primary responsibility, is to ensure that those rights are upheld. The flip side of that coin, very simply, is that we have responsibilities then as citizens. And a strong civic education articulates both sides of that coin. That young people have rights, that all people have rights, but that concomitant with those are responsibilities. When you think of the job of a teacher, let me just give you kind of a day in the life. I taught for 12 years at Hillsdale College, so I don't have classroom experience on a day-to-day basis with secondary schools, but for more than 20 years have worked with those teachers. And so what they're coming in very often to is a classroom in which they'll have maybe 6 or 7 classes. They will have 100 to 150 students. Those students in a place like where I live in Fairfax County, a bedroom community of 1 million people, it's a large county, just outside of Washington, D.C. I live in the swamp so that you don't have to. The things that the teacher sees is a tremendous diversity. In Fairfax County, there are more than 100 language groups where children are speaking a language different than English at home. So what is the challenge that that teacher has? He or she knows about the pluribus because it's represented in the classroom right before them. What they want to do, and this I found over and over and over again, is bring some notion of the unum. We're in a nation in which our national motto is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And I would suggest to you that nobody knows better than a teacher how difficult that is to do. So imagine that you're in a classroom where you're having students from a wide array of different religious backgrounds, different political persuasions, and you want to then that day talk about, say, something like immigration. Our teachers tell us that the most difficult subject to teach, with respect for each other's opinions, is the issue of immigration. There are many others, because as we become more and more polarized, the tendency and the pull is, and young people recognize this in different ways, right? You all are involved in the political process. You know what that means. You have come to learn in a way, how do you talk to neighbors? How do you try to persuade? What young people worry about is, if you disagree with me, are you going to end the friendship? Am I going to be able to have friends if people disagree with me? And so they feel the effects of polarization in ways that they don't even know quite how to articulate. But the teacher's job is to try to go to some of those third rail issues in the United States political discourse today and give students a means by which they can go forward, in which they can disagree, in which they can lay out their convictions and not just their feelings. Because if any of you have teenagers, your parents or grandparents, you know that teenagers have plenty of opinions. They have plenty of feelings. The difficulty is to get them to be dispassionate, to be reasonable, to think about these things and to say that it's not mainly about my feelings. What it is about, in fact, education is moving from opinion to knowledge, and from knowledge to wisdom. And that's a hard thing to do. And what we find with tens of thousands of teachers across the country is that they wake up every morning with that as their job. And they take seriously the idea that their job is not to come in and speak to their political opinions and insert them into the classroom as if that is the line that students must toe. So kind of like our nation as a whole, it's shaped like a barbell. Teachers sometimes on either end of the political spectrum feel like their job is to proselytize. And what we stand for at the Bill of Rights Institute is that it's very important that those teachers mainly point students to primary source documents, to a discourse. Think of kind of like a Socratic dialogue. We're one of the largest organizations in the country that teaches teachers how to do Socratic discourse, how to do that kind of back and forth. I hope all of you have had an experience at some level in your formal education to be in a really great Socratic seminar. Because what you know is that you can, at the end of that class, feel like your voice was heard, but also that you've really heard other people. And so what we do is construct curriculum materials. There's some examples here behind me. You're welcome to take a look at those, grab one of the flyers. Everything that we publish is online, free of charge to the end user. So teachers do not have to reach into their own pockets, and taxpayers aren't on the hook either. We do not accept aid from the federal government nor from any state government. We're completely independent. We're supported by generous benefactors and philanthropists. In the last 2 years, more than 5,000 people have raised their hand and said, we want to help support the work of the Bill of Rights Institute. We're really grateful for those partnerships. They make possible us offering these resources to teachers free of charge. You know, the average textbook costs about $150 in the high school level. I don't know if any of you have had to pay the college textbook bill for your children. That can run up to $400 per book. And so what we did a few years ago is we said, this does not make sense. Why should the taxpayers of Kansas or Texas, where they spend $400 million every year on textbooks? $400 million. Just imagine the shipping costs alone. I don't know about the young people that you know, but the ones that I know and what I know from my professional line of work is that they're reading on this. And that's okay, because there's a way in which you can digest a lot, especially when in the high school grades. It might be a different thing. I think students ought to learn in hard copy books when they're younger. And they ought to learn how to write cursive, and they ought to learn some of those very important fundamentals. But by the time they're in the grades that we're working with, in the high school grades, they are going online to find out information. That's where we are. We published with an outfit out of Rice University a history of the United States called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a few minutes. The subtitle of that resource is A History of the American Experiment. We are an experiment in whether or not human beings can govern themselves. We're an experiment in self-government. And that's the big question today. Are we capable of that? You know, when the founders sat around in the Constitutional Convention for that long, hot summer, their main preoccupation when they went back to the pubs and the places where they were staying in Philadelphia, and the letters that they would write each other were, I don't know if we're going to be able to have the educational program requisite of a free people. They were confident, despite the very difficult nature of those deliberations over those 4 long, hot months, that they were going to be able to get to a consensus. It was hard. But what their real concern was is, are we going to be able to have an educational program that can really equip citizens with what they need to know in order to be self-governing citizens? George Washington wrote one of those letters during one of the dark weeks of that convention. And he said, you know, I'm confident that we can get this thing done. What's going to happen, though, is it's up to the community at large. We can lay the foundation, but it's up to the community at large to raise the edifice. There's something really beautiful about that phrase, isn't it? It's up to the community at large to raise the edifice. That is our job. That's the job of educators. And what they do when they receive these digital materials is take students on a journey. And what I would suggest to you is that the main thing that you all can do as citizens active in this community is get to know the teachers here. Take them out to coffee. Thank them for what they're doing. Ask them what they're doing in the classroom to uphold that idea of self-governance. And find out what kind of resources they're relying on. Because the interesting thing about high school teachers is they're going to a lot of different sources. They're going to YouTube. They're going to the Bill of Rights Institute website. They're going to lots of different organizations and pulling together the material, because you know what they've done with those 10-pound textbooks? Not just during COVID, but before COVID. Those things that give out after 9 years because the glue gives out, Those things that are outdated just as soon as they're published, they're really expensive as well. They keep them to the side, let them gather dust, and they go online. That's what we found in our business model. And so around those resources, then, we construct professional learning programs. Educators, once they become certified, have to earn a certain number of credits to maintain that certification. And we provide them, and have done so for tens of thousands of teachers across the country, professional learning opportunities in person and online, for which they earn these continuing education units. And you know what comes out of those conversations is a genuine kind of civic friendship. What we have to do is break down those barriers in this country so that we can once again, even while we disagree on many things, renew those bonds of friendship. And that's why I think it's so important that a viewpoint diverse perspective be provided for in curriculum. You know, a student ought to learn about things that are going to be running contrary to what the kind of received wisdom is. They ought to be challenged. And they ought to know that they cannot graduate high school without having that perspective that having your opinions challenged is a really good thing. You know, one of the reasons that I think we've seen so much of the problems on our college campuses regarding chilled free speech is that students have not been challenged at the high school and middle school level to gain those habits by which, if you are challenged, you don't immediately recoil and say, I don't want to listen to that. What you start doing, though, if you're challenged repeatedly, is saying, you know, I need to hear other perspectives. And so when we designed this textbook that sits on the tech platform created by Rice University, their project called OpenStax, we hired 100 historians. And we said, you're going to write on deadline. Amazingly enough, they all turned in their stuff on time. That was a kind of miracle. But 2 of them won a Pulitzer Prize. Amity Schlaze is a writer. There's people from all different universities all across the world, really. We have Oxford, Stanford, Princeton, Georgetown. We have Hillsdale. We have community colleges, West Point. We have university professors that know their stuff but also can write clearly. That is a very small subset of academics generally. But what we did is we asked them to write on topics that were controversial in history. So for example, you can go and say in this digital resource, is the Constitution of the United States a pro-slavery document? And you'll get one view that says yes and another view that says no. And the students have to confront both views. Now we do that not because we want them to just believe that there's no truth. Of course, the goal of education is to arrive at the truth. But that journey is one in which you need to be challenged to understand that these questions in history and in civics are multifaceted. And that in order to think critically and to really gain those skills of critical thinking, you have to have something about which you can think. So content matters, and the learning of that content matters most. And if you do so in a viewpoint diverse way, then by the time that students go off to college or whatever they do after high school, they are in a position where they understand that rather than canceling people, that rather than trying to shut down free speech, to shut down free expression, what they would do is invite challenge. And that's a hard road because those teachers, kind of go back to our day in the life of the teacher, there's a lot easier path than all of that I just described than to just say, let's go back to some boring, bland textbook version. Let's give them history in a box. History in a box is kind of what I think of with Howard Zinn. I don't know if any of you have read Howard Zinn. Anybody familiar with this thinker? So he's a historian. He wrote a book that became very famous called A People's History of the United States of America. And A People's History said that there's 2 main things that Americans have stood for: guns and greed. He was asked by the late night talk show host Jon Stewart, have you seen any improvement in American history in the way that we extend and that people are accorded rights? Have you seen any improvement? Because he's very critical of the American founding. And he said, no, I've not seen any improvement at all. This man, an anarcho-Marxist, became wealthy off the publication of this book and attendant curriculum materials. And his organization exists now to basically spread the news that he did during his lifetime, that American prosperity is based on a lie. Now, if that sounds like a conspiracy theory, it is. It is a conspiracy theory, and it's one that is not true. The challenge right now in education is that it's very easy to sell conspiracy theories, because actually doing real history is hard. It's a jagged line, it's a crooked line. It's not neat kind of packages of material that you can just say, look, here are all of the answers. That's my main quibble with most history and civics textbooks, right? Because they make it so easy in the sense that the smart kids just memorize the stuff and regurgitate it back and get a 5 on the AP exam and then hope, I never want to take another history class in my life. 500,000 students every year take the AP test in American history. Just this week, the Bill of Rights Institute's book was approved by the College Board. And our competition are mainly groups that are major publishers, global publishers, that have tens of millions of dollars devoted to every book, and tens of millions more to the marketing of those books every year. And so what we're doing for a fraction of that price is going toe-to-toe and saying, let's truly have a marketplace of ideas. Let's talk about these things. Let's go back and do history, and let's do it right, and let's do civics in this way that really gets at the whole picture. Now let me just talk a little bit about kind of the state of civics today. So it used to be that a few years ago, if you put the word civic or civics into YouTube, you'd come up with Honda cars that had been kind of souped up for drag racing. Now when you search civics, you find a lot more resources on YouTube. And while many of you may, when you want to know something, go to Google, a teenager goes to YouTube. And so if you go to YouTube and you punch in Brown v. Board of Education, what you'll find is the Bill of Rights Institute video on that Supreme Court decision. You'll find Marbury versus Madison as the top hit. And you know, even things like the Electoral College, which are controversial. What we do is present the Electoral College and say, here is the way it was designed, here is why it was designed that way, here are some criticisms that have been lodged, and here are responses to those criticisms. You decide. We think that that's the way that education should be done. One of the YouTube commenters, a student, said, I really liked this video because I was expecting just a kind of screed against an electoral college, and instead I found something that was very fair-minded. Young people actually want that kind of thing. They want to be treated reasonably, and I think that we can make a lot of progress in this country by inviting them in to that adult conversation. How else are they going to become self-governing unless we have some confidence that they are going to be able to, by the time they're 16, 17, and 18, engage in these conversations about tough questions? The Bill of Rights Institute, you may not be able to see that very clearly. It's an Instagram post from a teacher. And what we did is send out to her and many others around the country a curriculum. It's on the table here, relating to the 100th anniversary of women being accorded the right to vote. That happened last year, and it's a great story as to how that happened. Do you know that the appeal that was made by the suffragettes, the suffragists, was to the principles of the Declaration of Independence? At the Seneca Falls Convention, where Frederick Douglass was the only man to speak and was in support of women gaining the franchise, the kind of touchstone was, hey, we have the rights that are ours by nature, by the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, the extension of that idea would be that all people, men and women, should be able to vote. And so we tell that story. Why do we tell the story? Well, one, it's a really important milestone in American history, but also it shows young people how to do social change within a constitutional context. 1619 versus 1776 is kind of this sort of an argument. What does it look like? Those people aren't having really a kind of easygoing back and forth where they're really hearing at each other. They're yelling at each other. And the problem that we have right now, from my perspective, is that the 1619 project is too much of a kind of conspiratorial view. What it suggests is ultimately that the US was bankrupt, morally, politically, and in every other way in 1776, that the true founding of the nation was not 1776, but 1619, when the first transatlantic slaves arrived on our shores. And while there are some things in those essays that are of real substance and that are worth reflecting on, and what they have done is touched a nerve by appealing to a very deep thing that I think is important for us to take seriously, which is that there are many of our fellow citizens who feel right now alienated from 1776. They feel alienated from our nation's founding. And yet they suggest, very unfortunately, that one of the main reasons that the American Revolution was fought was to perpetuate the institution of human enslavement. They have not, though they tempered and modified the statement just a little bit, they have not retracted that fundamental claim. And for that reason and others, there is no way that the 1619 Project should be the mainstay curriculum for teachers. That's the position that I have and that we take at the Bill of Rights Institute, and that many scholars around the country join us in saying. Now, that being said, I am not in favor of any effort at the state or federal level to ban the 1619 Project. That takes me to the 1776 Commission. So to counteract 1619, President Trump called together a group of academics, and they pulled together a report. And that report came out just before January 20th, and I think in its kind of haste, it wasn't able to lay out everything especially clearly, but the commission was basically saying what we need to do is do more things from the national government level to establish curricula. And my challenge and really problem with this idea is that the United States has very intentionally over the course of our history never had a national curriculum. And I don't think that we want to give up on the principle of federalism for the idea that there should be a curriculum if it can be written by the people that one side or another really likes. I think it's too dangerous. You know, the number of nations around the world that have kind of what they call patriotic or civic education from the national government is astounding. And oftentimes what they do is put out textbooks, and these textbooks rotate according to who's in charge. And they say, you got to toe the line here. I saw this firsthand in Iraq just after Saddam Hussein was ousted. And what I experienced in an effort with a delegation of 9 other Americans, we were sent there by the State Department to try to help reconstitute civic education in the wake of Saddam's ouster. And what was interesting in giving a talk like this, I used the term civic education, and in Arabic it came across as loyalty to the leader. I could see that it wasn't landing and that it didn't quite work. And so we clarified the translation, right? Because what do we want? What's patriotism? It's not loyalty to any one leader. Patriotism is the love of the principles of the ideas that stand behind a regime. Love starts with knowledge, and it's built up with habit. We have to start again with a groundswell of activity. So I would say that just as I have very real concerns about the 1619 Project's approach, so too do I have a problem with the 1776 Commission's kind of methodology and idea that we should just grab hold of the national reins of power and do with it whatever we can to get whatever we need done in the short term. What's the opportunity here for education as a whole? There's about 20 million kids that are part of the market of the Bill of Rights Institute. You know, dual enrolled students are a part of that, those who are in community college. What we need to do is really think about how do we serve all of them? And so in the last couple minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions if we have time, I want to tell you about what our kind of response to the current environment is and what we're doing. I mentioned Life, Living the Pursuit of Happiness, this digital resource that we had. Looks like this is a really popular gathering here. He can come in, you know. Let's not distract him. He has an important job there. That's remarkable work. We're pretty high up here. So This book, published online, has this title because we want to point young people back to the Declaration of Independence. And you might not be able to see this really clearly, but what this is a calendar. So again, let's take our teacher view and say, what is it that really serves educators? Well, they need to be able to have a lot of different options because they have a lot of different student needs. The beautiful thing that I see in so many of our teachers is that their whole purpose in being a teacher is because they care about each and every one of those kids that's sitting in front of them. There really is a deep care among so many educators, and they want to come to know those individuals and give them the right materials that speak just to where that kid is at. And personalized learning is the term of art that's come to be. And a tech tool like this allows that teacher to kind of, with a particular class, assign things on a particular day very easily. Structure that curriculum in such a way that it meets the needs of as many of those students as possible. So they can take one of the 450 components that tells all of American history, that story, and plug and play on a calendar like this. Now this is going to be hard probably for you to see, especially in the back, but this is just kind of the view that a teacher gets. You can add readings, there's a lot of stories. The thing that we've left out so much in our history is just telling great stories. Why did David McCullough become a best-selling author? Because he was not a professional academic historian. A lot of academic historians kind of resent that about him. And he said, you're just a generalist. Well, he told great, riveting stories. And that's what we need to get back to, I think, for young people, that we really capture that moral imagination and get them thinking about exemplars, both for good and ill, right? Those people, men and women, we can point to and say, this is something that was tried, this was a sacrifice, this was a struggle. Again, getting back to that theme that history is a hard thing to grapple with. It's not an easy story always. But there are many, many high points, and there are many, many things that we need to bring in front of students so that they can say, there are real heroic things that have happened, and I want to model my life after those human beings that have done those heroic things. So this is Benjamin Franklin and the first abolitionist petitions. Those are questions. You know how oftentimes when you're reading a typical textbook and you're tested maybe a month later, well, that's a long time. What if you ask questions right after you've read the material? Brain research shows that human beings are able to retain that material that much better. And so what we've done is put 2,600 questions in the heart of this resource so that a student, right after they get done with the reading, they click through, see if they mastered that content. If they get questions wrong, more pop up to help them on the side on which they're leaning. If they ace it, then the questions get harder. Now what's really great about this is then a teacher can get a progress report. Real time, that day, that hour, understanding is Johnny performing poorly on this section, is not resonating with the material around the Civil War, say. How's the class as a whole doing? For us as a provider of curriculum materials, we can see how our class is doing, and right now we have, since this book is launched, more than 1,700 courses in which this resource is the primary textbook. And so we're getting those data analytics back, which helps us in turn correct course where we need to. If you make a mistake in your Houghton Mifflin, what you have to do, imagine, is correct it in the next version, which oftentimes is going to be out 6 years later. This is just more of that kind of dashboarding, and that gives you a sense as to the scope right now that this resource is in. And this is a testimonial from a teacher who writes us and says, he's in the state of Arizona, that this has really been a godsend because he is faced with that challenge every day of having about 175 students come through his classroom. And that's a mammoth undertaking, and when, especially during COVID, schools have been shuttered, classrooms have not been open, teachers are not relying on those textbooks even more. So that gives you a picture, an overview of what we're doing at the Bill of Rights Institute. Let me stop there, ask you to jump in with any questions, thoughts, or concerns that you have, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks for sharing with us today. You talked about the virtues that underlie our government work. Talk a little bit more about those. Where do we get those? Where do they come from? How do you guys view them?
So I'd be happy to share, and perhaps it could be circulated, the link to a document that we have in which we articulate those and very short definitions for each of them. What we mean by that is that there's certain intellectual virtues, there's certain moral virtues, and certain civic virtues ultimately. And what you ultimately want to do is think about civic education as habit formation, modeling behavior for students. That's so much of what teachers do. But that's where those stories come in. When you learn about what George Washington did in battle, you learn about courage. When you learn about what Abraham Lincoln did, and how often do we hear a president who would write a commanding general and say, as Lincoln did, you were right, I was wrong. You learn about humility. You learn about responsibility from a person like Frederick Douglass, who 20 years a slave, escaped enslavement, became a person, one of the best known orators in America, and lived a life of probity and really a kind of responsible excellence. We want to go to those virtues that are hard won. Washington wasn't born self-governing. In fact, when he was a young person, we know something about what he was. And I think if he would have been around during the era of Instagram, he would have been all over Instagram with selfies. He was vain. He was a guy that was also incredibly ambitious. Now, ambitious is not a vice, but a virtue is coming into control of your emotions, right? And having temperance. And what Washington ultimately had to do was put down those passions. He wanted to be famous. And in the French and Indian War, he basically kicked off that whole thing with actions that many historians think were pretty rash. He learned from that, though. He didn't love war. He did want to be famous for some of the wrong reasons, and he came to realize real, true excellence, moral, civic, and intellectual, is born of this idea of self-governance. That's why when push came to shove, and he was given the opportunity to retain the sword, the commission that he had been given, imagine he held it for 8 years. He was at home at Mount Vernon a couple times, incidentally, stayed overnight there a couple times. He held it for so long that his retaining that would have been an easy thing. But you know what he did in Annapolis? Was hand that commission back. And then upon the occasion of potentially running for a third term, he said, I will not do so. That is an act of self-governance, and that's what we want to teach by example. And why I would add that it is an outrage that the city of San Francisco would strip a school of his name.
Okay, next question right back here.
First of all, thank you for coming, and I'm very encouraged by what you said about the number of teachers that are asking for these materials. What I'm curious about is that I know that administrations have been shutting down the First Amendment in public schools and the college campuses, and I'm curious when teachers get pushback from their administration when they want to teach the materials, do you have a plan in place to support them and maybe refer them to free attorneys that will ensure that they're able to express their views in the classroom?
What's interesting is I'd amend the problem just a little bit in saying that oftentimes it is the legal counsel in a school district that's a challenge. But you know what they'll say? They'll say, like they did across the country after the events of January 6th, don't talk about this. Now, why would you do that? Because you don't want to have a fight on your hands, right? Where does the fight come from? The fight often comes from parents. And the parents are saying, I don't want to hear, or I don't want my child to hear position X. So what I would suggest to you is that oftentimes what needs to happen is for the taxpayers, the parents, in a school community to buoy their school principal and say, we support an environment in which free expression and the confrontation of all of these important issues, however controversial they may be, that they are talked about. And we will be right there with a responsible educator who is doing a kind of viewpoint diverse approach to support them. And again, on the good news side of things, most teachers don't want to have their positions politically as front and center in the classroom. They know that that's not the appropriate touchstone. They want to use primary source documents. They want to use materials like ours that are viewpoint diverse and say, let's look at a variety of different perspectives with a through line that points us to the principles that have underpinned this nation since our founding. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we have to rebuild, is that relationship of trust with school principals, superintendents, and others that are in those positions of responsibility. Because, why do teachers pull the plug a lot of times? They pull the plug not because their students are incapable and there's going to be a melee on their hands. It's hard. Classroom management is hard. But they pull the plug because they often feel like the administration does not support them in even bringing up these topics.
The next question here.
Yes, sir. I'm trying to remember my history, but if my brain is correct, that when I was a little kid, I was told that the Pilgrims came to the United States in 1620. Why aren't we talking about the Pilgrims being part of the founding of America?
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent my grad studies years each year I was in Boston and went down to Plymouth each year and spent it with a family friend. And they marched, and I marched with them in the Pilgrim Progress, an exact, down to the person recreation of that march in the first Thanksgiving. And a couple years, it was canceled. And it was canceled because there were protesters there. And the protesters were saying that of history, kind of in that Howard Zinn view, that things started going downhill from that very first time that the Pilgrims gathered. And what I would suggest to you is that we do need to teach those things. And of course that should be front and center. And the true reason for Thanksgiving being offered needs to be brought out. And again, in many, many schools across the country, that is still at the center. But it can be a both and, right? So what we need to do is say, what happened in 1619 is there and it's real and we need to teach it. But we need to understand and give students at the age appropriate level an introduction to those ideas. And what I would say about slavery, it's a very difficult topic, but overall the way that we approach it is to give voice to those who were enslaved, to tell their stories like Frederick Douglass, to bring out the evil nature of that institution, but also to point to the fact that our country in the founding laid down for all the world to see an indictment of that institution and said that because human beings are equal, as Frederick Douglass later came to say, what they were doing in the Constitution was putting up a kind of scaffolding that could be removed by later generations. Now we know the blood, sweat, toil, and tears that it took to remove that scaffolding, to remove the institution of slavery. But I take the perspective of somebody like Douglass that says we should not forget what happened in our history, but we should also be able to recognize that the Declaration of Independence is true and that its promise is real. And so I agree with you that there's a really important way in which if we go back and try to erase certain parts of our history, be from whatever political direction that is happening, we do a disservice to that real idea of intellectual curiosity and of giving young people the answers that they really should be coming to. That's the kind of work that we do with teachers, to work through these primary source documents and really give them the tools by which they can present things with a full knowledge of the picture, the complexities, but also we can't get lost in the complexities, right? What's happening in San Francisco is they've stripped a public school not only of George Washington's name, but Abraham Lincoln. They also said that Dianne Feinstein shouldn't have a school named after her, right, in that same list. But I looked at that list because there's an annotated version of it, and you look at the historical evidence that is being cited there, and it is not done with an academically credible way. And that's what I find as a political scientist and somebody who's spent a long time working with historians to get these kind of questions right. That's why we hired 100 historians. You know what? There are some there that very much disagree with others, and we did that intentionally. It's not a monolith. There were people that are progressive and there are people that are kind of more conservative in their viewpoint, and the reason that we do that is because we wanted students to see those clash of ideas. But what all of those teachers shared is a liberal in the sense of classical liberal, a commitment to free speech, to an understanding that only by sharpening opinions and viewpoints are we going to become better. And that they were willing to have that debate and to try to build in with students that idea that we should do this debate in a civil way. Because this idea of just excluding certain portions of history does not make any sense in any way that we think about it.
My name is Brent Davis. I'm the president of Complete Education Tutoring and Test Prep. We do ACT Prep here. And I'm just thrilled about this new textbook that you developed. And very proud of your work there. And I guess I have two questions. The first one is, are you aware of any legislation in any state that is promoting diversity of thought in the high school classrooms? Particularly in Kansas, if there isn't anything, but anywhere would be fine. And what are your suggestions or best ways to meet our teachers? How can we go about meeting teachers and having good conversations, and how would you work toward that? Thank you.
Great questions, Brent, and thank you for the work that you're doing. The first part is, there's a really interesting project that I would commend to your attention. It's called Educating for American Democracy. The website is educatingforamericandemocracy.org. Just this week, we have released the results of an 18-month-long journey. I served as a member of the steering committee and as a member of the the committee on civics and political science. And there were about 300 people involved in this project. And what we did is we had a big old argument for 18 months. And the reason that there was an argument and a debate is we said we want to try to see if we can craft a common roadmap. And where we landed is a pretty lengthy document that asks questions at each grade level. These questions are going to that place of how do you do history and civics so that they're twins, that it's kind of like a double helix. You know, oftentimes we've pushed them apart and there have been all kinds of problems that have resulted from that. But this Educating for American Democracy roadmap is something that at the Bill of Rights Institute we are endorsing, and we have one kind of asterisk in our endorsement. We do not think that the effort to gain kind of federal funding is a good idea. But rather, think of a big, long document that has a lot of questions. What now has to happen is answers to those questions by teachers. And the interesting thing is that as part of this argumentation, we realized that the kind of common discourse that we were having over this time might even be a kind of model for the kind of thing that needs to happen in our classrooms. Because I'm committed, and I hope all of you are too, to, despite where the political differences are, to say that we need in this nation not two versions of civics, not 3 or 4, but one. We need to agree, as hard as it is going to be, on a lingua franca, a common language, a common understanding of what it means to be a free people. And we need to get beyond some of the things that can even get us to that table. And so I was at the table for 18 months, and we are backing this thing, and there's going to be some controversy. There already has been about this thing. But what I would suggest to you is that it goes to your second question, because when you sit down with the teacher, don't presume that you know what she or he is doing. Just say, there's no agenda in the sense that I don't have a particular gotcha set of questions here. What I'm trying to do here is just understand, what are you doing? What is your vision of civic education? What is your vision of history? And as they speak to that, befriend that person. Because it's hard to be a teacher. And those men and women who are devoted to that task are very often, I have found, and I've shared with you today, are people of not only good intention, but good results. And let's say you end the conversation and you see some points of disagreement. Well, have another round. Have another go at it. Before you write an op-ed or before you sort of do something like that, come to that place of civic friendship. I think that's the only way that our nation is going to pull ourselves back from the brink on which we are right now. And it's going to be hard. But you know, if people, we think of the founders, right? The founders as if they were all one block. They hated each other at various points, right? They absolutely went at each other with hammer and tong. But yet there were moments, despite that there were great reconciliations. Jefferson and Adams dying hours apart, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, reconciled in part by the ministrations of a wife in Abby and others. That's the kind of vision that I think we need to have for getting back to a place in America where we can have e pluribus unum.
Dr. David Bobb. Thank you.